One thing people don't realize about the Sea of Galilee is just how deceptive it is, and I know this personally. I grew up in Jerusalem, and every summer I would go with my family and we would spend time around the Sea of Galilee. I was there fishing and swimming, and it was pretty much my vacation spot. And over time, I got to learn more and more about the sea. And the strange thing about the Sea of Galilee is that it doesn't feel threatening when you first look at it. It's not an ocean with no end in sight. It actually is small enough to cross, and it looks calm and I would say even friendly. I remember in 2022, I was standing by the Sea of Galilee and I saw these huge waves just coming down and crashing by the shoreline. And it was the most unbelievable thing that I have ever seen on the Sea of Galilee. And I remember looking at this and thinking to myself, the disciples were probably not exaggerating their fear. At the end of the day, these folks were experienced fishermen. They were not visitors. They were not people who just showed up to the Sea of Galilee for the first time. And so when the Bible tells us that they were terrified, I completely understand what they're talking about. But if you think the story is about the disciples being terrified of the storm, then you're really missing something, because the problem wasn't just the storm. Of course, they were very afraid of it, but it's what happens after that. And that's what I want to focus on, which is the very thing that Jesus does when he calms the storm, because by him calming it, he's communicating something about himself to the disciples. I'm excited to be sharing my personal experience about what is it like to be around the Sea of Galilee, having grown up in Jerusalem and having guided many people visiting the Holy Land in Jerusalem, in and around the Sea of Galilee, looking at the very sites where Jesus ministered, preached, and healed. And so I would like for this to reach as many people as possible, so you liking and subscribing and sharing this content will give as many people as possible the opportunity to have access to this first-hand experience that I'm about to share with you. Okay, so let us begin with the Sea of Galilee. Yes, the Bible calls it a sea. It is technically a lake, but the word sea that is used in the Bible is actually a reference to this body of water having the properties of a sea, specifically when it comes to major and violent storms. So the name connects with the events that happen over the Sea of Galilee. But there's also another reason why it's called the Sea of Galilee, and that is we have to put ourselves back in the shoes or the sandals of the people who lived back then. Because in their view, in the biblical symbolism of the time, the sea, for what it is, represented danger, represented chaos, and pretty much represented the unknown. So the lake is about 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. And you can be standing on one side of the lake and you can pretty much see across the entire lake over onto the other side. So sometimes you get this false sense of safety because of how the lake appears to you during the day. And this is what makes it very dangerous. So let me explain why. The lake is a bowl that sits at about 700 feet below sea level. And as you look at the diagram here, you could see how the lake is surrounded by a number of hills. For example, over and onto the east, you see the hills of the Golan Heights. And in the west, you see the hills of Galilee. And here's where it gets interesting. You have warm air sitting over the lake, and that's because of the natural process of evaporation, because the sun strikes the lake, and then air will rise and just continue to circulate around the Sea of Galilee. In the meantime, and on top of those hills that we just talked about, you have cold air, and cold air is heavier by nature. So once it starts descending toward the warmer air above the water, the entire atmosphere begins shifting. And so the wind starts accelerating across the surface, the water becomes unstable, and within moments, the lake can turn very violent, and that's when you have this collision. And just like that, there's no warning, there's nothing you could do to prepare for it, because it's very sudden, and everything seems to happen over the course of minutes. If you read what Mark says in the actual Greek, he uses the word seismos. And that Greek word is actually used for an earthquake, for just earth-shattering power. And so this is not some rough afternoon that the disciples were complaining about. We're talking about a very harsh, life-threatening event. I want you to notice something because we do see a parallel in the Old Testament, specifically when we look at Psalm 44, because it says, "Awake, Lord, why do you sleep?" And that's exactly what the disciples do. In fact, if you put them right next to each other, this is a one-to-one correspondence between the book of Mark and the Psalms. Here's where the climax of the story comes in, because what Jesus does is actually going to get the disciples to be even more terrified than they were during the storm. I don't think you've thought about this, and it was the most amazing revelation when I learned this. Jesus stands up, and then Mark tells us that he rebukes the wind. Notice that Mark uses the word rebuke, which is often reserved for cases of exorcism where Jesus rebukes demons. If anything, this should tell us that the water, the waves, and the storm, they represented a kind of this chaotic, this violent, even you might say demonic power that wanted to impose itself on the boat and the disciples. And in the Greek, what Jesus says when he speaks to the sea, he says, using the Greek words, "Siopa pefimoso," which translates to silence and be muzzled. This is a very interesting translation because there is this element of Jesus trying to tame this wild force of nature. And he is demonstrating this incredible power over it. And that's something you only read about in the Old Testament, because let me ask you this. Who stills the storms in the Old Testament? And who commands the sea to be quiet? It's not a prophet, it's not an angel, it's not a king, it's not a human. It is only God that can do this. And we see this clearly in Psalm 107 verses 28 and 29. It said, "He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed." Again, you take Mark and then you take Psalm 107, you see people terrified on the water, they're crying out for help, and then the storm is stilled and the waves calm down. And in the psalm, we know it's the Lord, and that's what the disciples have read and what they have known all their lives growing up from reading scripture. And here, now in the Gospels, the person who does the same exact thing is Jesus, who is the Lord. And so when you see it this way, you realize this is not just a miracle, because what Mark is doing is really fascinating. He is taking Jesus and identifying him and putting him pretty much in the same position as God. And you notice this because after Jesus calms the storm, the disciples who were afraid of the storm are now terrified of Jesus. I mean, these guys seem to be afraid of everything. Because what we read is that they look at each other and then they ask, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" We learn from the book of Mark that demons know him and recognize him. The wind knows who he is. The sea knows who he is because they all submit to his authority. The only people that don't know who this is and they ask about his identity are the disciples themselves. Again, if you watch the video that I've made about Mark, you will recognize that Mark is trying to put you in the story where you are living the events as they transpire with the disciples who understood that Jesus had a mission but still couldn't wrap their minds around it and often had questions because they've never experienced anything like this before. Here's the third and final layer of this, and that is, once Jesus calms the storm, we continue reading that they reach the other side. And the other side is pretty much the eastern banks of the Sea of Galilee. And that was a region where the Gentiles would have lived. It's a region that was associated with impurity, with death, with spiritual uncleanness. And having read Mark, I've noticed that he often would deliberately choose the events and the order of those events. Because what seems to be happening here is that the disciples are moving from one kind of chaos into another. Remember, there's the storm on the water, and then we continue, and then they enter into this impure territory, the territory of the Gentiles, where there's tombs and pigs and all kinds of different impure things. And what seems to be happening here is that the disciples recognize that Jesus has authority over this chaos. And that really tells them what kind of mission Jesus is on, because he's not trying to turn his back to the chaos or turn away or run away from it. What he is trying to do is to confront it and bring it into order. And honestly, I think there's a lot to learn, because it really encourages us to embrace certain struggles and hardships. We should believe that in the face of those struggles, there's someone in the boat with us, and he is there not because he doesn't care, he is there because he cares, because he's the one that has authority over the chaos and the difficulties and whatever it is that is confronting us. And so the trust has to be in him as we cross a certain threshold for us to be able to grow as disciples in pursuit of what God teaches.